Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of the Ithihasology podcast. I'm your host, Eric Chopra, and today we have a very special guest with us. So, this is our first episode featuring somebody, and for today's episode, we are joined by Dr. Kavita Singh. Dr. Singh is an art historian with an interest in the history of museums in colonial and post colonial India, the Global Art Museum, religious objects and secularization of art, religious revivalism and its cultural forms, heritage discourse, historiography of art history, history of Indian courtly painting, Mughal Rajput artistic interactions, and painterly styles as vehicle of meaning. In today's podcast episode with Dr. Singh, we talked about her entry into the field of Indian art history, the scope of this domain, perceptions of art, the politics of aesthetics, and the many ways in which art adds nuance to our understanding of our shared and complicated histories. For those of us who are listening to us on just audio platforms, I would recommend that for certain sections you tune into the YouTube version of this episode because Dr. Singh had some very interesting visuals to share with us. Now, without any further ado, let's begin. Hello, good evening, Dr. Singh. Thank you so much for coming to the show.
Thanks
So,
so much for having me. It's really wonderful to see all the initiatives that are being taken by such incredibly young people.
uh,
It's really exciting and inspiring, and now retrospectively, I think puts many of us to shame.
oh no,
May we spend our college years.
no, it's the work that you have done that has inspired all of us to do this work now. We're just making use of technology in some other ways. Um, so I think I want to start off this interview on a rather personal note, on a note that, because we do get historians to talk about their work, but also we want to know, what inspires one to go and pursue the work that they do. So I think the first question that I have for you is which piece of art was it, or what was that one, eureka movement that ascertained that this is the field that you want to engage with and invest in? So if you could start with that.
So I don't come from a background that is academic or arty.
Mhm.
And so I had no natural preparation while I was growing up for anything like art or art history. And one day, as part of my BA, I was exploring widely and reading various things. And I read an essay that I thought was just absolutely fantastic. It was about the Natraj sculpture, and it talked very movingly about the aesthetics, about its symbolism, about the mythology. It quoted poetry, it talked a little bit about Chola history, and I was gobsmacked because I had never read anything that was as wide ranging and that subjected one beautiful artifact to so many different perspectives and gathered so many different kinds of knowledge, and where the writing also seemed to be very free. This is somebody who is writing to celebrate a beautiful object rather than to dryly study it. And I didn't even know what I was reading. I went around with that book and I asked people, what is this field? This is what I want to do. And
Mhm.
somebody told me, oh, this is art history. And then my next question was, where can I study art history? And there were just a handful of places in India at the time. And off I went. So my eureka moment was not an artwork really, but it was the allurement of this very interesting, very synthetic, very flexible, and very beautiful discipline. That's what
Mhm.
drew me.
Wow, fascinating. So, but now I think you're interested mostly in artworks from the Mughal and Rajput period. But I think your entry to the world was by looking at Rajasthani pieces. So, could we talk about that?
Right. So when I began work, actually, when I began looking at art and art history as I studied it at the time was something which was very focused on the formal qualities of the artwork. And I somehow felt that was not quite enough. And I was a little bit divided about whether I wanted to do my PhD within the discipline of art history or whether I wanted to get into something like cultural anthropology, which would allow me to see context. Eventually, I figured that art history is elastic enough to take all these different approaches in. But I was very keen to work on some form of art where I'm not just going to an archive and looking at an artifact which is stored in a box, but I wanted to see something that had a living context. So I can see the artwork, but I can see it being handled, I can see it being responded to. And so I decided to study what are called picture showman traditions, in which you have a painting which is made in association with some literary forms like ballads or epics. And they are actually used as part of the recitation performance. So I studied two traditions, one from Bengal, one from Rajasthan. I can show you what the Rajasthani one looks like actually.
Yes, please.
So this is called the Far painting tradition, and what was well known, I think, is the Pabuji Ki Far. But the one I studied was Dev Narayan Ki Far. And I can actually, I hope, even play a little video to show you how the painting, which is something that we often see in hotel lobbies or in airports or in other places where a very big space has to be filled with something that is folkloric, is actually not a decorative object, but is considered a mobile temple. It's considered a shrine in which this deity resides. And traditionally, in the context that it comes out of, you're only supposed to open these paintings for the sake of an overnight recitation of the epic which these paintings are associated with. And so you have traditional bards who would actually be singing and dancing and performing. So this was the kind of tradition that I was interested in, where I thought, oh my God, I'm going to be able to see a work of art actually functioning in its living context. So I won't just be looking at an artifact, but I'll be looking at a series of relationships with artifacts. So that's how I started out. And actually, Eric, there's another area of my work that I later then got led to, because when I was looking at all of this and I said, oh, I'm seeing art in its context, you know, and I realized that actually there is no such thing as a decontextualized work of art. Because no matter what you do to a work of art, it's always moving to a new context. And there are new sets of relations with new sets of audiences or publics that are being developed. And so then I realized that I ought to actually also be looking at what I was thinking of as a no context, which is our context for looking at art, oops, which is of course the museum, you know. So it's the museum, the art gallery, today the website, the Twitter feed or Instagram. All of these are actually contexts in which we encounter art, and they all are worthy of study.
Yes.
So
And I think a discussion on museum right now as to what we are seeing happening to the National Museum, I think it's very important to talk about how museums are also not museum as an institution itself is also a space of fashioning personal memories. And I think we can later in a discussion discuss a bit about the book that you edited with Saloni Mathur, which is one of my favorite works that you've done. So yeah, that's very interesting. So now we're at a space where you have found your field, and you've started working with it, and you started to find your specialization too. Now I think a lot of people who want to venture into this field, but they're thoroughly confused about is how is it what is the process of examination. What does the process of examining a piece of art entail? So apart from the painting itself, what are the types of sources that you and students pursuing art history need to tap into? And I'm sure one also needs certain linguistic skills to decipher what is written in paintings or primary sources from the time. So what's the process like?
well, firstly, let's not just dismiss the idea of the painting itself as a source. It's a tremendous source. And it is also a source that unfortunately many of us working in India, ironically, have very little access to. If you compare yourself with a student who is, say, in London or in New York, you will find that they will be able to make appointments in museums and be able to handle actual works of art and study them in a way that you and I could not dream of in India. The first time I went to London, I remember going to the British Museum study room, and I had requested some materials which I got, but here I was a scholar already with a PhD and coming from India and all of that. So I thought, okay, they're accommodating me, very nice. But the girl who was sitting at the table next to me was flipping through a box of original Rubens drawings. And she had been given them to look at because she was writing a paper for her MA course on that set of drawings, right? Now, that kind of access to the original works of art is not something that we can even, unfortunately, dream of in our institutional frameworks. And I must say that that is something that is irreplaceable. However many high resolution images you and I might have access to, being in the presence of the actual work of art and engaging with its materiality is something else. Then the second thing is that there are layers and layers to the physical body of a work of art, some of which can only be opened up with technology. So there is very exciting revelations that become possible when scholars get permission to X-ray works of art, when they get permission to do infrared photography, or when they get to examine them under microscopes. And of course, sometimes they are doing things like pigment analysis or structural analysis or some such things. But sometimes when you do infrared photography, you can see multiple layers on the same page. So you can see what the original conception was and how that got covered over and altered on the artist's or the patron's second thoughts. And you have this microscopic analysis, which I think a scholar like John Seiler has shown us the tremendous benefits of, where you actually have to take a microscope to be able to see and read some of these teeny tiny inscriptions which are not visible to the naked eye, which the artist has made. And you just have to absolutely wonder at the ability of the artist who was able to write something that small, that today we need these kinds of microscopic devices to be able to even see them in the first place. Now, that's the physical object, of course. And of course, these things get embedded in a very wide range of contexts which have to be explored through different sources. So you do need to know your history, but you increasingly need to know your connected histories, because we have tended to think of a certain artifact as belonging to a particular context. And so we would ration what we read by a preconception of what is relevant to that context. And we might be actually quite wrong, because we think of the past in the silos in which we want the past to have existed. So if I tell you that an important Sultanate manuscript, which is now sitting in a museum in Berlin, was found in a monastery in Sikkim, what would be the texts, and indeed what would be the languages, and what would be the documents that you should want to explore in order to understand that manuscript? Of course, you will want to read the Persian text that the manuscript illustrates. Of course, you would have an idea about the dynasty that might have commissioned that manuscript. And so if it's from XYZ Sultanate in this century, you would want to read about that. But what about all these other movements that the manuscript has made? Would they also enter your ken? So there is a very wide range of sources which we can only begin to even start tabulating when we get out of that expected question mode of thinking about the past. And the way in which people, if they are looking at, let's say in my area, if they're looking at Mughal painting, people will only look at Persian sources. If we are looking at a painting from Mewar, people will only look at Rajput sources, they will only look at Brajbhasa literature or Mewari literature, and it won't occur to them that you might need to read something from the other side of the aisle, right? You might need to
Mhm.
find Persian sources. These kind of things also hobble us in our understanding. And so I think today some of the most exciting work that's being done in these areas are actually coming from people who have mastery of both Persian and Sanskrit, or both Persian and Braj Bhasha, because they are actually equipped to bridge the divide that exists in our minds today, but did not exist in the historical past.
Mhm. I'd like to actually thank you for mentioning John Seiler's work, because I was remembering how he talks about the Ramayana of Hamida Banu Begum, and
Yes.
how he talks about in these rocks you can see these faces of, beasts and animals, and you really
Yeah.
need the piece in front of you. So that's what I'm wondering now, that students in India who are pursuing this field, and given the fact that so many of these artworks are spread all around the world in private collections, museums, so the primary artwork that they're seeing, is it these are high resolution images only? Is that how they're studying?
I'm afraid that is how they are studying it now. And I must say that even that is a huge advance on the way I had to work when I started preparing my classes at JNU, which would have been about 18, 19 years ago. Because at that time, the internet was not the thing that it is now, and free access databases did not exist the way they did now. So in those days, what I would have to do is pack a laptop and pack a scanner and go to the National Museum library, because there were some
Mhm.
books there. And for some other books, I would drive to Gurgaon, because there was the American Institute of Indian
Mhm.
Studies library over there, right? And you would hear that, oh, in 1963, Khandalwala published a book in which he has a color plate of XYZ painting from this series, right? Images were so rare to come by
Mhm.
just a couple of decades ago. I'm sounding like a dinosaur, I know, for this digital generation. But really, I must say that however much we bemoan not having actual physical access to the object, you're still in a much better place. And particularly considering the way in which Indian paintings and manuscripts have been dismembered and scattered all over the world, the
Mhm.
possibility of a digital reunification is a huge advantage that you have now.
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, yeah, because we are only thinking, we are bemoaning the loss because we haven't really bemoaned the loss of not being able to even access physically or digitally. So, yeah, I get what you're saying. So
Uh,
because of this being digitally available, then I think in terms of the work that you're doing, has the process been altered radically due to the pandemic and everything shifting virtually?
the speed of digitization of collections and artifacts, I think, already had gathered momentum in the last decade, particularly.
Hmm.
So I think that the pandemic, if it has accelerated it at all, it has um, maybe added 10 kilometers speed to something that was already going at 80 kilometers an hour.
Hmm.
Like if an institution was already involved in granting free and open access and digitizing a lot of its collections, the fact that they didn't have to deal with public facing tasks, they didn't have to deal with the opening of a gallery, so they could spend more time on the digitization, has given a little bit of a fillip. But this is a direction that a lot of non-Indian collections
Hmm.
already had decided to take. Sadly, many, by and large, Indian collections tend to lag way behind. There are a few initiatives. You might know about the Museums of India website, where a few of
Hmm.
the centrally managed museums have put up some of their material. How we access it, how high the resolution is, how easily searchable those databases are, or
Hmm.
how well publicized they are, that's another matter. But one is grateful that something is there. But in the pandemic, what has really been a major shift and a major advance has been this webinar explosion.
Hmm.
So not so much the digitization of archives and collections, So, on the one hand, we have been so lonely and so isolated, locked in our homes, filled with fear about contacting another human being and being in their presence. However much we may crave it, we are also filled with fear where the other person becomes a threat. But at the same time, we have also overcompensated, I guess, by this proliferation of all our venues for talking and listening to each other online.
Mhm.
And I find this absolutely extraordinary. Again, I'm going to sound like a dinosaur, but it reminds me of what it felt like to be an academic and get JSTOR for the first time.
Uh-huh.
You know? So there was a time before JSTOR
Yeah.
where if I sat down to write a paper on something, I had no way of knowing what the current debates or recent work had been. Or
Hmm.
even for my PhD, I remember writing a letter by hand and putting it in the post to a friend who was in Cambridge. And I sent her a list of things that I needed, and she photocopied them and sent them
Hmm.
by post to me, right? So you can imagine the speed
Right.
and the nature of access and how much you can ask for in those days, right? And then when we got JSTOR, it was like, oh my God, we've got a place at the global table. We can
Hmm.
actually read what was written very recently. We can see what so many different people are saying. And now that has happened with webinars, it has become, the liveness of it, the speed of the interchange has become so fast where we can see people who have very recently finished their PhD. So it's absolutely new work which isn't circulated yet. They are making presentations. We are attending conferences. And that sense of being in a backwater, sitting in Delhi, not knowing what is happening in Stanford or not knowing what's happening in MIT,
Hmm.
today you can, right? So to
Yeah.
me, that has been absolutely extraordinary. I don't have the perspective to know what then, but
Hmm.
I think that just judging from the little circles of things that I have seen, I think it also folds in people from India into circuits that were dominated by Western institutions because they were wealthier, they were more connected, they had all these symposiums. People from the East Coast were always traveling up and down to each other's symposiums, right? So I
Hmm.
think it has done something to now increase that circle and broaden the conversations, make people like yourself visible to professors out there. It should have quite an impact going forward. And I
Yeah.
hope this spirit of generosity actually outlives the pandemic.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. I think, especially the point about these webinars and all of this becoming so easy, the accessibility it has granted to students and the gap that has now been bridged. And I also
Yeah,
notice that a lot of there's this always this image, the stereotypical image of an academic, sitting in this brown room situated somewhere in the middle behind a desk. There are just books all around, and if you're an archaeologist, you are just burdened under rocks. I think now when you come and you see so many of these historians coming to Twitter, Instagram, YouTube, other
yeah.
platforms, you get this sort of personality out of them. Okay, there is an academician, but this is also a person. She's equally passionate about the work that we want to go in. And I think that's something that's phenomenal. So yeah,
But
definitely.
the other thing about something like, I don't know if you follow this handle called tweeting historians, which
Yes, yes.
circulates. So you have someone once a week, right? They become the tweeting historian for a week and they get the whole following, and it can be from different periods and with different concerns. But the other thing that is very, very, I think, decisively different about this moment where they have taken to social media in order to communicate is the accessibility and the responsiveness and the dialogic nature, right?
Mm-hmm.
We've always thought of knowledge coming from institutions that are very strongly hierarchical and are very protective of their hierarchical structures. So
Yes.
I think the fact that an Eric Chopra or an Ishan Sharma can organize these talks in which an Ebba Kok or, I mean, you name it,
Mm.
they are coming and speaking on your invitation
Yeah.
is one thing. But that a tweeting historian will put out a tweet and immediately like 30 people will write back and say things or make comments and they might respond to them is also something that is really rather remarkable.
Yes, yes, for sure. Um, so I think one of the things that you just said was that you want some of these things to outlive the pandemic. And I think one of the things that I would want to that I definitely want to exist beyond this pandemic is that this sort of universal empathy perhaps that is being created. Everybody sort of coming to this understanding that there is this grief that we are surrounded by right now universally, and that we need to be a little more empathetic towards it. And from this, I want to link it with an article that you recently wrote for Scroll, in this art column that you've started. You wrote about Dashuta's funeral. And I wanted to ask you about, how artists are so many times and mostly are transcending aesthetic boundaries. And in this painting, you capture the essence of grief. And that of course taps into your emotions. It goes beyond visuals. So, you know, could you shed some light on this capability of art to tap into different emotions? And I think in some ways art invoking emotions is also linked with this art having the ability to tap into your senses. So you've worked on Deccan art, which we can take in the next question. So let's start with the emotional aspect of it, if you could just.
Um, Art doesn't just deal with emotions, of course, it does. But I think what art does, which is different from your session with your therapist, which is also dealing with emotions, what art does and what it has to offer has to do with the aesthetic filter that it puts on things.
Mhm.
And sometimes the aesthetic filter can trivialize the emotion, and sometimes the aesthetic filter can make it more profound, no?
Mhm.
Where it can have that quality of, in some way, through aestheticization, making grief, let's say we're only talking about grief right now, but actually through aestheticization also making grief bearable, you know?
Mhm.
Because in the immensity and immediacy of the moment of bereavement, there is no aesthetic. An aesthetic, by definition, means that there has been some kind of distance, some kind of reflection, some kind of recognition of patterns, and therefore also some some rendition of, or some revelation of, the possibility of acceptance, I think. I
Mhm.
think the form of the elegy, which is about grief and sorrowing, but which also transmutes our sorrow into something aesthetic, is actually about that, about somehow making, not denying the unbearability of the unbearable, but making that very unbearability somehow bearable. No,
Mhm.
it's an alchemical thing. And so I think art can do that for every emotion, not just the negative ones, but also the positive ones, the immensity of the rush you feel when you are in love, where you literally lose your senses. You lose your sense of
Mhm.
who you are, the sense of even the division of yourself and the other can get bounded, can get blurred. You lose yourself in love. But when you read a love poem,
Mhm.
when you see a painting that very beautifully evokes the experience of love, not only does it reflect and affirm to you what you feel, but I think it also has this wonderful quality of confirming to you that what you feel is universal, because she has felt it too. The poet who wrote this poem, she
Mhm.
has felt it too. Or the lovers who are depicted here are depicted by an artist who knows exactly what it means to tremble at somebody's touch, right?
Mhm.
And somehow even those deeply interior feelings that we have, which in their immediacy are untranslatable,
Yeah.
to have them translated like this, to have them universalized like this, where you recognize that it is part of a common human experience, I think that also makes coping, being, carrying on also possible. And that is why for so many people, particularly at times of distress, I think art offers a kind of comfort.
Yeah, for sure. You put it very wonderfully, because I think a lot of times for me too, art becomes a very safe space. Sometimes histories that we read, be it in school, be it in college, they can, though I think there are efforts at best, from our professors, that come from a professor, that they want to make this an inclusive classroom. They want to make these texts accessible. But sometimes when you are just burdened with this, inundated with dates, names, kings and places, these pious figures that you cannot perhaps relate with, I think art becomes very comforting, because then I would come across a painting, that's perhaps even showing homoerotic desire, and the text does not reflect that. And I'm like, okay, so our histories have always had this, and we need to tap into these other sources. But now that I mentioned desire, though, I think what another thing that art historians do is, of course, make people realize that art is also not always literal, that it's not always what is seen. And I think it's the perfect time to introduce a figure that, well, I'm charmed by and you've written about, Muhammad Shah Rangila. Who, and in this painting that you examined of him sexually engaging with a woman, and this work has earlier been seen in your article. You say that it was seen as this painting of an emperor who had a sex obsessed mentality, and nothing more than that. But your stance really changed my way of looking at art pieces. Just okay, that's an aesthetic, that's a piece of aesthetic, and I'll just look at it and I'll move on. But as even Professor B.N. Goswami says, that when you enter the world of art, it is a very layered experience, many layers to unfold. So could you talk about that painting and then just elaborate on this ability of art to not be literal?
Uh, well, so I didn't bring that painting for today's session, like for the little PowerPoint that I made. But the paper is available on my academia page, I think. So you're welcome to direct your readers or your listeners to that. Um, I was interested in that painting and writing about it as a kind of a methodological exercise, actually, because it was a painting that has been seen as titillatory, and it has always uh, been uh, been discussed, or even not discussed, just mentioned, from one dimension. A little bit of that ho hey kind of. Oh, we always knew that Muhammad Shah Rangila was an incompetent ruler, and here's proof of how debauched he was, and no wonder things went downhill. And that picture is held up as though it was a snapshot taken by a paparazzo. You know, ki, dekho, someone has sneaked in and taken this picture, and it reveals what the guy was all about. And that really felt to me like an injustice, to the world of painting, not just to that emperor or to that artwork, but to the world of painting and what it does. Because, of course, these are carefully constructed images. Painting of that quality would have taken months to make. It must have been an officially ratified commission. So what lies behind the making of a painting like that? And what are the layers of meaning that are implicit in a painting like that, which you can read by looking at different elements of the iconography? That everybody is obsessed with just the two figures who are engaged with each other, but there are two figures who are attendants. What does their presence mean? There is a marble pavilion. What does its presence mean? There is a curtain. What is that doing? What is it supposed to remind us of? And then going beyond that to try and think about how things like sexual shenanigans even were being spoken of at the time by looking at contemporary poetry, bazaar gossip, and so on. For me, it was a methodological exercise. It's like you take a little gem in your hand, and it has many facets, and you say, okay, if I look at it from this side, this is what I see. What if I turn and look at it from this side? What will I see? Right? So it was like, okay, if I examine the composition, what am I going to see? If I think about the colors, what am I going to see? If I look at just the sex act, what kind of sex act is it? And what does that tell me? What is the nature of the relationship between the couple? What does that tell me? What do we know about poetry? from that time, which might refer to acts like this? What do we know about the medical literature of the time? And what was the thought at that time about male potency and so on, right? So it just became for me like an exercise ki aap dekhte raho, you keep looking at it, and every angle from which you decide to look at it can open different dimensions.
Yeah. Um, so I wanted to ask you about the paintings from the reign of Jahangir. And, in his works, we see him as a figure who is exploring his political desires, be it killing somebody he never killed, hugging somebody he never hugged. So if we could start with that, maybe, if you could just shed some light on that.
Sure, I did put some images together. Let me see what the next one is. Okay, maybe we can come back to these later and I can come to exactly the images of Jahangir that you were talking about. So here's a very famous painting from Jahangir's reign, which is uh, enacting exactly the kind of fantasy that you were talking about, where he's hugging somebody he never hugged. This is one of the famous dream pictures of Jahangir, and it shows him embracing the Shah of Iran, whom in fact he never met. And as I'm sure your listeners know, because this is a super famous painting and its interpretations are also well known, the painting shows a dream in which the Shah came at a time when there were actual political tensions between Mughal India and Safavid Iran, and said something conciliatory to Jahangir in the dream. And when Jahangir related this, I suppose, to his coterie, his favorite artist produced this image. The inscription actually tells us that it was made as a Nowruz gift for Jahangir, or that it was presented to him on Nowruz. And we know that there is a tradition of making gifts by the artists and other talented people on that day. So you can think of this as something which is uh, produced through the imagination of the artist. It's not a composition which is dictated to him ki bhai tum aisa banana and the emperor will be pleased, but it is actually a composition that the artist comes up with and presents to the emperor as a kind of a triumph of his imagination. And this shows this conciliation between the two men being enacted in the form of an embrace, in which the two of them form this kind of axis mundi, which stretches from the globe of the earth to the orb of the sun. So they have actually cosmological dimensions, these two people. But as has been remarked many times, the artist also pulls out every trick in his book to make it quite clear who among these two is the dominant one. So you see Jahangir, he's larger. The Shah looks puny in comparison, is looking up to Jahangir. Jahangir is very patronizingly looking down at him. And the two of them are on these two animals who are normally enemies, but they are peacefully at rest next to each other, which becomes the symbol of universal peace. But everybody has pointed out, of course, that Jahangir is on the lion and it is the Shah of Iran who is on the lamb. And as Ebba Koch pointed out, the main point of contention between the Mughals and the Safavids was why the Mughals were holding on to Kandahar when it was rightly a possession of Iran. And the Mughal lion actually has his paws squarely on Kandahar. So this is a very propagandist picture. And you say, okay, this is whatever it is, it's stroking his ego, it's pleasing him, it's turning his dream into this apocalyptic vision. But when you see a painting like this, you say that, oh, this painting, which was meant to illustrate a passage in the Jahangir Nama, this is of a different order of things altogether. And it shows us Jahangiri painting, which becomes so sophisticated and naturalistic that the way in which it depicts the horse, the way in which it depicts the characters, the way in which it depicts landscape and architecture is so believable. Now that there's a kind of a naturalism that they achieve, which is beyond what was possible in Akbar's time. So you really tend to look at these pictures as the most fabulous kind of documentary sources on events from Jahangir's life. But this painting is in the Chester Beatty Library in Ireland. And the cataloger of this collection, Linda Leach, in her catalog, she's done a really masterful analysis of the painting. So what is going on at this point? Jahangir has just come to the throne, and just a few months after he has come to the throne, his eldest son Khusro has rebelled.
Mm-hmm.
And this is a big threat to Jahangir's sovereignty. Jahangir himself has come to the throne because at the last minute he was reconciled with Akbar, where Jahangir himself had rebelled.
Mm-hmm.
And he had been this rebel prince who had set up a rebel court, and he had crowned himself sultan, and he had sat on a throne, and he had disobeyed his father and done all kinds of slights which were humiliating for his father. But when, through the intercession of Jahangir's grandmother and so on, Akbar and Jahangir are reconciled, and Akbar, who was thinking of leaving the throne to Khusro, says, okay, I won't go against the natural order of things. I'll leave it to my son, to Jahangir. After that, in the Jahangir Nama, Jahangir flatly denies ever having rebelled against his father. There's more than enough documentary and historical evidence that tells us that he did, including coins that he issued in Allahabad in his own name. But he says some people of bad counsel suggested to me that I should rebel, but I never did. And he says this in the context of complaining about how he was such a good son, and his son Khusro is such a bad son, ki lo and behold, he's come to the throne and Khusro has rebelled. So when he hears that Khusro has taken a detachment of the army and has gone off to find support from, some other quarters, Jahangir decides to pursue him very aggressively. So he sets out, and as soon as he sets out, the first place that he goes to is to Akbar's tomb at Sikandra. And he says he goes there to pray to his father's soul, to ask for his help in this mission of capturing Khusro. And you have this painting then, which shows the party of Jahangir. Jahangir is very easy to identify, of course, because he's standing out from the crowd. But you have other very easily identified noblemen in his entourage. And when they are near Sikandar, they find that there was a guy from Central Asia, some prince who was an ally of Khusro's, who somehow got left behind by Khusro's army. So he was wandering around looking lost. And one of Jahangir's soldiers found him and brought him and imprisoned him. And here, this poor fellow, he's had his turban knocked off, and he's being forced to bow to Jahangir. So here is this poor Mirza Ghulam of Central Asia, who is having to accept that now he's going to be in shackles in front of Jahangir. Now, this happens in Sikandra. And sure enough, what we have in the background is Akbar's tomb, which is absolutely the correct thing to have because that's where they went. But I think Linda Leach points out that Jahangir had commissioned Akbar's tomb to be built. And then he had gone off to Lahore for a few years. The building commenced, and then, these events happened. Khusro was captured, whatever. He went to Lahore for a few years, and then he came back after about 3 years. The tomb was half built, and he didn't like it at all. And he ordered that never mind what has been spent on it, pull it down and make it again according to these new specifications. So this is an event of 1606. But the tomb that is being shown is the tomb as it was built in about 1610. So, in a sense, then, what it is doing is it is showing also, or it's enshrining in the background, that very magnificent tomb, which is built with no expense and no aesthetic labor being spared by this devoted son, who is betrayed by his own son. So it's totally in the line of, the somewhat deluded, perhaps self-deluded or propagandist line of Jahangir, that he is the good son, Khusro is the bad son. It's doing that, right? And then the second thing that it's doing is that it actually shows Khusro's own father-in-law as though he was part of the party that was loyal to Jahangir. So it's like another father is repudiating a disloyal son, right? So there are all these other things that happen what we would call major photoshopping now.
Mhm.
All these things happen a lot in Jahangiri paintings.
Yeah. I really like that you use the word photoshopping because that day I was looking at this painting from and of course, Jahangir, as we've already said, that he's constructing these very dreamy works in his painting, that idealized landscapes and so on and so forth.
Yeah.
And that day I was seeing this painting of his, where he was just with his entire army, and they were all watching this fight between a snake and a spider. And
Yes.
I was talking to my friends. I was like, interesting painting, and my friend said, drew a very interesting analogy, and they said, it's like how we scroll through our Instagram or social media feeds today. When you're just doing nothing, when you're just simply, you're having leisure time. So I think that also is a part of Jahangir's work, that he's documenting a lot of things. Yeah.
I wouldn't actually call it leisure time. Again, Eva Koch has been doing a lot of wonderful work, and she puts Jahangir's interest in animals and plants and so on um, as a parallel to the interests of some of the Enlightenment philosophers and scientists who were also studying the natural world very intensely
Mhm.
around the same time, and sometimes even a bit later than Jahangir, right? So one of the one of the masteries that the emperor had to have was a mastery not just of men or of guns, but also a mastery of the world of knowledge.
Mhm.
And many of these rulers, Akbar and Jahangir, modeled themselves on Alexander, but not necessarily the historical Alexander,
Mhm.
but Alexander as he is described in Nizami's poetry, where he is the perfect king,
Mhm.
and he is the king who is the quester, that he turns away from conquest and he becomes interested in spiritual conquest, and he becomes interested in the conquest of knowledge. So he seeks out Plato, as his teacher. He
Mhm.
then has Aristotle as his personal tutor, that he seeks out sages, that he wants to invent a hot air balloon so he can look at the world from a height. He wants a diving bell made so he can plunge to the bottom of the ocean and
Mhm.
study that, right? So this idea of mastering territory through the force of arms, but also mastering the universe through your sagacity, your perception, your knowledge, both of these were part of the ideal king. And both Akbar and Jahangir very much fostered that, that mode of kingship, or that image that they were kings in that mode. So
Mhm.
Jahangir's interest in something like a spider fighting with was it a snake,
I
right?
snake, yeah, I think, yeah.
Would not be only curiosity or idle leisure time
Mhm.
pursuit. It would be his pursuit of his kingly majesty by other means. And
Mhm.
so this whole thing of being interested in plants or animals and documenting them, breeding animals, cross-breeding different species, which they actually did for Jahangir. These were experiments where he would observe and he would make extensive notes in the Jahangir Nama about the qualities of different animals and their traits and behaviors. Um, this was part of a desire to master the world through knowledge.
Mhm. Okay. So I think then that painting would almost be like a painting of, the emperor going for a hunt. Of course, that has that sort of,
Yes.
yeah. And
Yeah.
I think in
Something like that. There also, sorry, I'm
no, no,
interrupting, but
no.
there's also this turkey cock which is brought for him, right? And there's also
Mm.
a painting of him sitting on his throne looking at the turkey cock. So
Mhm.
you have to also think that when he sits on his throne and somebody brings him diamonds from Golconda,
Mhm.
or somebody brings him, gold from someone else or an elephant from Mewar, or whatever is the tribute that he's getting, it's because he has got these treasures through conquest and arms. But also, if somebody is bringing him a turkey or a zebra, it's
Mhm.
because he, as the seeker of universal knowledge, also is the person to whom these exotic things flow.
Right. Okay. Interesting. So I think you do have some more visuals for us that we were just looking.
Yeah.
Yeah,
So,
that'd be great.
I wanted to contrast this painting that we looked at, which we know to be propagandist,
Hmm.
with the subtler kind of propaganda that we have over here. And so, one of the reasons to talk about this is to say that paintings are important sources, but they are not transparent sources where you just assume that somebody has taken a candid snapshot of the times. You have to understand these as highly constructed texts, and you can only understand the nature of their construction when you understand the conventions that they are following, right? Or the inventions that they may be making. So you can't understand the painting on its own, but you have to put it side by side with other paintings with multiple narratives and figure out what it might be trying to say. At the same time, paintings also have to surely give us some kinds of information which you may not be able to get from other sources.
Hmm.
So, for example, this painting I find very fascinating. It's supposed to show the zenana of Muhammad Shah going off on a picnic. And I wouldn't say that there's anything of tremendous historical revelation over here, but just the idea of how spaces were organized, the idea that there is a built and settled space, and then there is empty space. And then you go for a picnic, you have to traverse all that empty space, which is just overgrown or which has barren ground. And then you again enter an area which is of this kind of um, cultivation where you have flower beds and you have pavilions, right? It gives you some sense of urban organization, which you may not find any description in a text, which will be as rich in terms of information as these images might be. Or we could look at this painting, which is supposed to show the birth of Jahangir, though it was made maybe 30, 40 years after the event that it's depicting. So it's a conjectural depiction, but still it shows um, the interior. It gives you a glimpse of a moment of birth happening and the interior of Zenana quarter, in which you have various people who are connected with the birth events depicted. And so it may not be an exact documentary image of how things were. Like, it's not that you're going to look at this painting and know exactly what Jahangir's mother looked like, but it's full of all kinds of information about norms and practices. So, sorry, but if you look at the whole painting, you see in the upper part of the painting, the chamber where the birth has just occurred. Sorry, the mother is lying there, the baby has just been born and it's in the hands of the nurse. And outside the doorway, you have the astrologers who are waiting, because for them to be informed very efficiently of the precise moment of birth is of crucial importance, because the child's horoscope has to be cast and everybody has to be told what kind of future he's likely to be and what kind of role he'll play in the world. So you have the astrologers who are waiting, and they have their various tables and their instruments, and you have this kind of kanat put up, this cloth wall put up outside the gate. And you have some women who, have to stay inside and are just peeping out to see what's going on outside. But here you have an older woman very confidently and very openly standing in front of them and telling them something that they need to know. And one guesses by the fact um, that she is transmitting this information and she's wearing some very nice clothes, she might be the midwife.
Hmm.
And she might be someone who has been very richly rewarded, so the shawl and the gold cloth on her head might be part of the gifts that she has just received for having so efficiently delivered this royal child, right? So maybe the midwife who delivered Jahangir didn't look like that. The artist who's making it wouldn't know what she looked like because he's making it 30, 40 years later. But the fact that there might have been a midwife or another such person, in his milieu, that she would be someone who would stand with a stance of this kind of confidence, as opposed to the tentativeness of this woman who is just peeping over the edge of the canard, right? It tells you all kinds of things which aren't necessarily put in words. So even for the historian, never mind the art historian, but even for the historian, there is world upon world to actually discover in these paintings.
Wow. Thank you for bringing this painting. I've never seen this one. I don't know how, though I'm always just endlessly, madly emailing to every museum in the world. Can this image be used or not? Thank you for bringing this. And what I immediately began thinking was when you mentioned this section of the astrologers, was that I'm sure that not everybody in these paintings is associated directly with the court. And of course, this painting is coming 40 years, 30, 40 years later. So I was thinking, these paintings do have all of these charts, sentiments, they have this meaning. And of course, we're talking about Jahangir. So what about access to the common population? What their messages in these paintings, but what are these messages for? Who are they for? Are the common people in any way getting access to these, seeing imitations, or what's the politics of that?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And we have to imagine that a painting like this would have had limited circulation. Its
Hmm.
audience would have been part of that small circle of people who would have been able to handle those very exquisite albums or books from the Imperial Library
Hmm.
in which these resided, right? Now, what is quite interesting when you look at particularly some Mughal albums
Hmm.
is that in the margins, you will often see depictions of people handling books. No, so these decorations that are made in the margins are often sort of meta commentary because it's inside a book, but it's often a reflection by the artist on the book itself.
Hmm.
And you do see people holding what look like very beautiful, gilded, elaborate, uh, very lavishly made books. And those people don't all look like royals.
Hmm.
So I think that the culture of gifting of books was something that was quite widespread. And so you can imagine a circulation and or even not just gifting, even lending, having soirees where people come and see something was more widespread than we might imagine. It wouldn't have just been Jahangir and his 20 buddies all through his life.
Hmm.
There would have been a little more than that. But books also traveled um, through what should I say, like copies that are made,
Hmm.
right? So we know this very well from what is known about the Mughal Ramayana. So something is made for Akbar, but then another version is made for his prime minister, another version is made for his mother, other versions are made maybe for someone from some other kingdom who gets it as a gift, right? So you have actually a lot of these very fancy imperial paintings which are inside these albums which may not have circulated very far, but you have multiple versions which could be sketches, they could be full paintings, so they could be made at different speeds and at different levels of finesse, which were often circulating. They would be given as gifts to
Hmm.
family members, to nobility, to allies. They would be held by the artists who would use them as calling cards when they're looking for other patrons. Then
Hmm.
they would say, I made something like this, for Muhammad Shah, but I can make one for you when you're the guy who's on the throne.
Hmm.
So some form of circulation was there, which was well beyond what we imagine by just imagining the highest quality works and very limited social circles. I think you get a hint of this when you start looking at the small numbers of things that we know are connected with mercantile communities. So let's say these Jain communities and what they were patronizing, that can become very exciting and very enlightening because it gives you an idea of a bourgeois class, and
Hmm.
it is able to patronize paintings, and those paintings are informed by compositions. It's citing and quoting things that were in the imperial paintings. So there is a circulation through reproduction, through repetition, through copying, which
Hmm.
I think makes these images travel more widely and become part of the, part of the visual vocabulary or the visual self imagination of the time, beyond what we currently imagine. And our era of digitization actually helps to understand that, because when museums were using analog media to
Hmm.
catalog their collections. So if the Victoria and Albert Museum or the British Museum are publishing a catalog or a book on their Indian painting collections, they will have a book which has maybe 20 color plates. So they will have chosen carefully. When they are digitizing, if they have enough funds, they'll digitize everything that they have. And that will include what we would think of as the bad art, right? The second rate stuff, the 19th century copy of the 17th century painting, right?
Hmm.
And when we start looking at those databases and realizing that, wow, there was a 19th century copy being made in Lucknow of an Akbarnama painting that was made in Agra or Lahore in the 16th century, then we realized that there was some intermediary which created that memory, that somebody knew what that Akbarnama painting looked like and was able to reproduce it. And there was also something that was creating the desire, that somebody said, I want you to make me a painting that looked like that Akbarnama painting. So what were these links? We may
Hmm.
not know, but it's very suggestive to think that those links were there.
Yeah. And I think certain paintings were also well purposefully made to be, sent out. So as you talked about, like Muhammad Shah Ragila's painting, for example, you talk about the bazaar gossip that it costs a certain,
Yeah.
and of course, made for this access. Okay, very interesting. So, well, I would love for this to keep going on eternally, but, so I think now I'd have to take a final question, and this is from our audience. And these are actually two questions, but I'm making them one because they sort of deal with the same idea of decolonization. So, Shreya Gupta from the School of Oriental and African Studies and Suchintan Das from St. Stephen's, they've asked two questions. Shreya Gupta asks your opinion. She wishes to know whether you think there is a lack of a decolonization discourse in India. And so Chintan asks that a lot of times we see common adjectives that are used in Indian art historical scholarship, such as voluptuous, that sometimes are imported from another linguistic tradition and sensibility altogether. And they possess etymological roots and the burden them with all sort of unintended semantics. So this is also in a way, perhaps linked with this idea of, a colonial hangover, if that's the word I can perhaps use. So these are the two questions. So yeah, over to you.
I don't know if the word voluptuous is something that we have to be offended by
Mm.
or reject or see as some sort of imposition, because the fact is that so much of the art itself is depicting many, many very, very voluptuous things, right?
Mhm.
So that is obviously a preoccupation or an interest, or whether it's an idea of something auspicious, it's connected to fertility, or it's just a celebration of sexuality, or whether, as some scholars have said, it's actually, to put it crudely, literally playing the role of porn, because somebody actually
Mm.
opined that, oh, temple like Khajuraho have this culture they have, because in those days so many people were dying in so many wars that to keep the population number up, people had to be stimulated. So they actually suggest that there was that intention behind the making of those temple sculptures. I don't know, but whatever it is, there is a tremendous celebration of
Mm.
the body. And the problem may lie actually not in the use of that word, but in our inability or our ability to see what exists only through certain frameworks which make whole other things invisible to us. And I'm sorry, I'm being a little unclear, but I'll explain to you.
Hmm.
One of the nicest books that deals with the issue of gender in Indian art was published by this feminist publishing house, Kali for Women, and sadly, it went out of print in the first edition. It was called Representing the Body, edited by Vidya Deheja. And it's real pity that that book is not easily available now. But I remember Vishakha Desai wrote this fantastic essay in it, in which she talks about exactly this voluptuousness, right? So she talks about the voluptuousness of the sculpture and the nature of the discourse, now the nature of the language used to describe it, right?
Hmm.
So she talks about sculptures from the second century, third century, what they might have meant, what context they come out of, what the physicality of the sculptured body might have been for in its time. But then she talks about colonial scholars writing about these sculptures. And she quotes at length, I'm forgetting which scholar it is, but this 19th century scholar who encounters this sculpture of some, I don't know, Apsara, Yakshi, something. And literally you can feel the scholar's kind of excitement and the body that he is confronting with, the detail in which he goes on about the fullness of the breast, the heaviness of the hips, the depth of the navel, all of that, like I say. Huh?
Hmm.
But when he is describing a bodhisattva figure,
Hmm.
and the bodhisattva figure at that time is modeled on these yaksha figures. So actually you can see the male genitals. They are sculpted, they are under the cloth, but you can see the outline. It is clearly part of the intention of the artist to depict that. The scholar describes the shoulders, he describes the chest, he describes the waist, and then immediately he describes the feet. It's like there's this zone of invisibility that he cannot bring himself to
Talk about.
talk about the male body
Hmm.
and its sexual organs. He cannot, like it's all right to have this great pleasure in describing the female body in all these details, but the male body, it's a threat to describe its physicality.
Hmm.
So I think the issue is not the word alone, voluptuous, but I think the issue is the vision with which these things are seen. And as Eric also pointed out at one point, were you not talking about some paintings which show these homoerotic scenes
Hmm.
with
Yes.
such tenderness and loveliness,
Yeah.
right? That there's no sense that you're making a statement by showing them, right? So
Yeah.
it's like what we reproduce, what we dwell on, what we want to discuss, what we see, which has so much to do with not the work that is out there, but the attitudes that are in here.
Hmm.
And, it's a question really of self examination more than the examination of the object. And the fact that you're asking questions like this obviously mean that you are thinking about these things, and we expect different kinds of writing, different kinds of discourses coming from you and your generation, so that'll be great. The other question, just remind me of what it was.
Whether you think there is a lack of decolonization discourse in India.
uh, so it's something that everybody wants to do, and it's not clear how you do it. And it's not my place to give any prescriptions, but I'll just share with you a recent essay that I read, which was not only a fabulous essay, but I said, Array, here we have it. Here we have a decolonial art history happening in front of our eyes.
Hmm.
So it's by Murad Mumtaz, who is teaching at Williams College in the US. And he is both an artist and an alumnus of the National College of Art in Lahore, where they have this very rigorous training in miniature painting technique. And then he has done his PhD in art history in the US. So he has training in both making and in analyzing. And I don't know what his personal background is or the different reservoirs of knowledge are that he can tap into. But he wrote such an exquisitely beautiful essay about looking at portraits of Sufi saints. So he takes these portraits of, I think it's of the, I'm forgetting his name, but the saint who was the like the spiritual preceptor for Darashiko and Jahanara.
Oh,
I'm forgetting,
Mhm.
but whatever. So he's taking that painting or those paintings and sketches, and he's talking about them. And of course, he's totally able to talk about them in the way art historians so far would have talked about them. He can talk about their formal qualities, the period that they come out of, the delicacy of the depiction. But he can also talk, and then he can talk about the historical context and, who was Jahanara and who was Darashiko, and what were the nature of their relationship with this preceptor of theirs, and what have they written and left behind. And he brings a gender perspective to it as well, where he talks about how despite her advancement in the spiritual path and the sincerity of her devotion, Jahanara could never become one of the spiritual leaders in that Sufi order
Mia Mir?
because she's a woman.
Was it
Mia
Mia?
Mir, yeah. I think it's about Mia Mir and his
Hmm.
portraits, right? And then he talks about this thing of looking. So he's looking at these texts and he talks about what it means to see your guru,
Hmm.
and what that act of seeing, or sometimes that his radiance is so much that you can't even see him. So in his presence, you're not able to even lift your eyes, right? So what it means then to have an intermediary
Mhm.
of a painting, to be able to see him, to meditate his face, or to get that spiritual learning from him through the painting, and how the painting is so much more important for the female devotee who
Hmm.
is not able to talk to him face to face than it is for the male devotee, right? And I'm reading this and I'm saying, wow, yeah, look at the range of skills, look at the range of sources, but look at the attitude, where this is an attitude which, without wearing anything on its sleeve, or without it stating anything overtly, actually has a kind of depth of serious respect for the nature and meaning of spiritual experience.
Hmm.
And that spiritual experience forms a part of what you understand the painting's work to be, that it should transmit something to the person who is the spiritual adept,
Hmm.
right? So you don't write it out just because it's some superstition or some irrational thing that those natives believe in, no? And it can
Hmm.
only have come from someone like Murad Mumtaz, who I presume also is brought up in a way which allows him to respect these traditions. I don't know. Of course, there are many things that are written which are pretty nutty, which by people, we won't go into that. But this paper seemed to me to have just done it all. I was just so impressed, and I said, here is your key to a decolonial art history.
Right.
But I felt also that the author is bringing every bit of his being, no? All
Hmm.
his skills, all his analytical ability, but also the quality of his empathy, the personhood, the childhood training, the whole sensibility, it's all there. And you're writing a beautiful paper without having to disavow any part of yourself.
Hmm. Wow. So I think I know my work for this week is to go right to this paper. And the work to our listeners is also to read this paper and also all of the work that Dr. Kavita Singh has done, especially that and she's been kind enough to upload so many of her works on her academia page, which we will be linking to in our descriptions. Um, Thank you so much,
And
Dr.
I'll
Singh.
send you a link to Murad's paper, right?
Yes,
So
please
you
do.
can send a link to that. Yeah.
Thank you so
Yeah.
much. This was a very enlightening conversation, and I'm so happy that you consented to coming. And yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you for doing this, Eric. And thanks to all of you young people who really give us hope for the future.
And that was me in conversation with Dr. Kavita Singh. I hope all of you enjoyed this episode as much as I did. But before I let all of you go, I must extend my most heartfelt gratitude. So, last week I conducted a virtual Heritage Purani Delhi walk with Riya Sarkar, and all the funds that we collected, we gave them to the Mazdoor Pehel Foundation, a citizen run initiative providing ration kits to migrant workers in the northern sections of Delhi. So, thank you for coming together for this cause and making this possible. I must also let you all know that on the 12th of June, Saturday at 6 p.m. IST, I will be hosting, along with Kudrat Singh, a virtual museum walk entitled Stories in Sculptures. So if you're interested in being a part of that, go to our Linktree page, which is linktree.com/ithasology, or our Instagram page, @ithasology, to get more information. Lastly, we are still accepting entries from school, undergraduate, and postgraduate students for the Ithasology Journal, scheduled to be released later this year. We're going to be accepting entries till the 12th of June, and I'm happy to announce that the journal will be read and reviewed by Dr. Mridula Mukherjee, retired professor of modern Indian history, and Dr. Aditya Mukherjee, retired professor of contemporary history. You can find more information on our Instagram page or our Linktree. And that's all for this episode. Thank you for watching. I'm your host, Eric Chopra, signing off.